Joseph Garrison rode into Mineral Creek, Nevada, on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1878 with a loaded pistol on his hip, a debt burning in his chest, and absolutely no intention of leaving alive anyone who stood between him and Franklin Conley. The town itself was the kind of place that had grown up fast and aged poorly, the way so many Nevada mining towns did in those years. The buildings along the main street were a patchwork of weathered timber and fresh-cut pine, some establishments barely more than tents with pretensions of permanence, others solid enough to suggest their owners believed in tomorrow. A barber, a dry goods store, a livery stable that smelled of horse and hay, a saloon called the Silver Horn that advertised cold beer in hand-painted letters on its front board, and a sheriff's office that looked, from the outside, like it had not seen much use recently. Dust lay thick over everything, the kind of dust that worked itself into the corners of your eyes and made the whole world look faded. Joseph had ridden hard from Elko, 2 days without much sleep, and his horse, a dark bay gelding named Copper that he had owned for 6 years, was road-weary and glad to stop. He tied Copper at the rail outside the dry goods store before he did anything else, because whatever else Joseph Garrison was or had become in 31 years of living, he was a man who saw to his horse before himself. He stood on the boardwalk a moment, pulling at the brim of his hat against the morning glare. He was a lean man with sun-darkened skin and a jaw that had seen too many days without a razor over the past weeks. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter, gray with a suggestion of depth beneath, and they moved over Mineral Creek's main street with the careful, measuring quality of someone who had learned early that it paid to know a place before a place knew you. He had waited 3 years to find Franklin Conley. 3 years of following whispers from one territory to the next, 3 years of asking careful questions in saloons and trading posts and frontier outposts, 3 years since Franklin Conley had ridden away from the Garrison family ranch in eastern California, with the deed to that property folded in his coat pocket, a deed obtained through fraud so brazen it still made Joseph's back teeth ache when he thought about it. Franklin had forged signatures, manufactured a debt that had never existed, and presented it all to a judge in Bodie who had either been paid off or simply too lazy to look closely at the paperwork. Joseph's father had died 2 years later, bitter and broken, convinced until the last that he had somehow failed the family. His mother had gone to live with Joseph's aunt in Sacramento. The ranch, 400 acres of good California Valley land that his grandfather had worked from raw ground, belonged to a cattle operation out of San Francisco now. Franklin Conley had made a very comfortable profit. Joseph was not entirely sure what he intended to do when he found the man. The burning in his chest said one thing. The part of him that remembered his father's quiet dignity, the way the man had never once raised a hand in anger even at the worst of it, said something else. But he had come all this way, and the coming itself had a momentum that felt impossible to stop. He went into the dry goods store because he needed tobacco, and because a dry goods store was always a good place to get the shape of a town. The bell above the door announced him. The store smelled of coffee and leather and the faint sweetness of dried goods. Behind the counter, organizing bolts of calico fabric with the focused attention of someone who took fabric seriously, stood a young woman. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair pinned up, but beginning to escape in small, rebellious curls around her temples and the back of her neck. She wore a plain blue dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and there was a smudge of ink on her left wrist that she had clearly not noticed. Her face was the kind of face that a man looks at once, and then has to work not to keep looking at not conventionally pretty in the way of fashion plates or the women painted on saloon walls, but something more interesting than that. Strong-boned and expressive, with dark eyes that, when she turned from her work and looked up at him, held a quality of direct intelligence that Joseph had not expected, and that consequently knocked him slightly sideways. "Good morning," she said. "You look like a man who has been riding for a long while." 2 days, Joseph said. There is water in the pitcher on the side table there if you want it. And I will warn you before you ask if you are looking for the barber. He does not open until 9. Joseph became aware that he was, in fact, in rather desperate need of a barber and felt unexpectedly self-conscious about it. I appreciate the warning, he said. I am looking for tobacco, actually, and perhaps some information if you can spare it. She set down the bolt of calico and came to the counter with the unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in their own space. I can usually spare information. What kind are you after? I am looking for a man named Franklin Conley. I understand he is settled somewhere near this town. Something changed in her face. It was subtle, a stillness that moved through her features the way a wind moves through tall grass, visible only in the way other things stopped moving. She studied him for a moment with those direct, dark eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed quite thoroughly. Franklin Conley is my father, she said. Joseph stood very still. He had not anticipated this. He had known, in an abstract way, that Franklin Conley likely had a family somewhere. A man like that usually did, kept a respectable life as a kind of camouflage. But he had not walked through that door thinking about it. Had not walked in expecting to meet anyone connected to the man except perhaps an associate or an employee. He certainly had not walked in expecting to meet a young woman who looked at him, the way this one was looking at him now, steadily and without apology, waiting. I see, he said after a moment. Do you, she said. It was not quite a question. My name is Joseph Garrison. He watched her face for recognition of the name and did not find it, which told him something. Franklin Conley had not thought enough of what he had done to mention it to his daughter, or perhaps he had simply lied about that too. Catherine Conley, she said, and extended her hand across the counter the way a man would, businesslike and assured. He shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was work calloused, and the ink on her wrist was close enough now that he could see it was figures. She had been doing accounts. "What is your business with my father, Mr. Garrison?" she asked. "It is a private matter between us," he said, which was the truth, and also, he immediately recognized, not something that would satisfy a woman like this for more than about 30 seconds. "I am sure it is," Catherine said pleasantly. "But my father is not in town at present. He rode out to the mining claim he holds a partnership in 2 days ago, and he is not expected back until Thursday. So if your private matter requires his presence, you will need to wait." She paused. "Or come back." He needed tobacco and a shave and a meal and somewhere to sleep for 2 nights, and the only hotel in Mineral Creek he had noticed riding in was directly attached to the saloon. He had the money for it. He had the time for it. What he did not have was any clear plan for the next 48 hours, and somehow that was made more complicated rather than less by the fact that Franklin Conley's daughter was standing in front of him with ink on her wrist and an expression of careful neutrality that suggested she was far smarter than she was letting on. "I will wait," he said. "The hotel next to the Silver Horn takes boarders," Catherine said, confirming what he had seen. "Mrs. Pratt, who runs it, is a decent cook and her rates are reasonable. She does not tolerate drinking in the rooms." "I am not much of a drinker," Joseph said. "Neither am I," Catherine said. "My father is enough for the family in that regard." It came out quietly, almost casually, but the honesty of it landed between them with a kind of weight. She looked faintly surprised at herself, as though she had not meant to say it, and then she collected herself and became businesslike again. "Now, what kind of tobacco?" he told her, and she found it and wrapped it without fuss, and he paid, and he should have gone. He had what he came in for, and the door was right there. But he found himself, without quite intending to, asking whether she ran the store herself. "Mostly," she said, folding the paper package with the practiced efficiency of long habit. "My father owns it. I manage it. He is good at acquiring things, less good at maintaining them." There it was again, that small, contained honesty, the kind that came from a woman who had been observing something clearly for a long time and had made a private peace with it. "You are doing the accounts," he said, nodding toward her ink-stained wrist. She glanced down at it, registered the smear, and rubbed at it with her thumb in a gesture that did nothing useful. "I am always doing the accounts," she said. "Someone must." She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "You had better go see about that horse of yours. You left him at the rail outside, and he is looking at this window like he expects to be acknowledged." Joseph turned, and there was Copper's dark face at the window, watching with the particular mild reproach of horses who feel they have been patient long enough. He felt the involuntary beginning of a genuine smile, the first one in longer than he could comfortably account for. "He always does that," Joseph said. "He is very handsome," Catherine said. "I will tell him you said so. It will improve his mood considerably." He tipped his hat to her and went out into the Nevada morning, and he did not look back through the window, but he was aware, in the specific way a man is aware of a candle behind him in a dark room, that she might have watched him go. The 2 days until Thursday moved with the peculiar inconsistency of time in small towns, some hours thick and slow, others gone before you registered them. Joseph checked into Mrs. Pratt's hotel, which was exactly as advertised. Clean, simple, and presided over by a compact woman of 50-odd years who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. He got a shave from the barber, who was indeed not open until 9, but who worked efficiently once he was. He ate meals in the hotel's small dining room and drank coffee, and tried to organize his thoughts about what he would say to Franklin Conley when the man returned. He went back to the dry goods store the following morning for reasons he did not fully examine. He told himself he needed lamp oil, and he did need lamp oil, but the truth was more complicated and less comfortable. Catherine was behind the counter again, this time helping an elderly Mexican woman choose thread. She spoke to the woman in Spanish, not the halting Spanish of someone who had learned a phrase or two, but the easy, conversational Spanish of someone who had grown up using it, which in southern Nevada in 1878 was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the warmth of it, the small joke she made that made the old woman laugh and reach out to pat her hand. When the woman left, Catherine turned to Joseph with the same composed directness she had shown the day before. "Lamp oil is on the shelf behind you," she said. "Thank you," he said, and found it and brought it to the counter. She was weighing him again with those dark eyes. He had the sense she had been thinking about him the way he had been, against his better judgment, thinking about her. "Garrison," she said. "That name is not entirely unfamiliar to me, I realize. Last night I was going through some old papers. My father keeps his important papers in a box in the back room, and he has asked me to organize them before." She stopped, reconsidered. "He has asked me to organize them. I found a land deed from California, Garrison Valley Ranch." The words fell on him like cold water. She was watching his face with the kind of careful attention that saw everything. "It is your family's property," she said quietly. "Is it not?" It was not a question anymore. She had worked it out. "It was," he said. The silence between them had a different quality now. She looked down at the counter for a moment, and he saw something moving through her features that was not guilt. She had done nothing, and they both knew it, but was something adjacent to it, the complicated feeling of being connected to a wrong you did not commit. "How did he get it?" she asked. He told her. Not everything, not all the details, but the essential shape of it, the forged documents, the manufactured debt, the compliant or corrupted judge, his father's death. He told it plainly, without drama, because that was the only way he could tell it without the burning in his chest getting the better of him. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said finally. "I know that those words do not fix it, but I am sorry." "You did not do it," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I have been keeping his books and managing his business for 4 years, and there have been things I have not looked at as closely as I should have." She met his eyes steadily. "I think I have not wanted to see certain things." There was a courage in that admission that stopped him. He had walked into this store ready to see Franklin Conley's household as an extension of the man, a thing to get past on the way to the real confrontation. He had not been prepared for this. A woman who looked at uncomfortable truth and did not flinch from it even when it reflected on someone she was connected to. "What will you do?" she asked. "When he comes back?" "I am not entirely sure," Joseph said, and it was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. She nodded slowly. "There is something else you should know," she said. "My father, he is not a well man. His heart. The doctor in Elko saw him in the spring and told him he needed rest and reduced whiskey and a less agitated life. He has followed none of that advice, but there it is." Joseph absorbed this. It rearranged things in a way he had not anticipated. "I am not telling you this to protect him," Catherine said, reading him again with that discomfiting accuracy. "I am telling you because I believe you should know the full picture before you walk in there with righteous anger, which I understand completely and which I think is warranted." She paused. "I am also telling you because I have spent 4 years managing the consequences of my father's bad decisions and cleaning up behind him, and I am tired of it, and I would rather have everything be honest, even if honest is harder." He stood on the other side of that counter and looked at her, and something shifted in his chest, not the burning which was still there, but something alongside it, something he did not immediately have a name for. "You are a very direct woman," he said. "I find it saves time," said Catherine Conley. He spent the rest of that day in a state of unusual restlessness. He walked copper down along the creek south of town, following the water until the sound of Mineral Creek's commerce and conversation faded behind him, and there was only the shallow rush of water over stone, and the dry desert smell of sage, and the distant purple mass of the mountains to the east. The light in Nevada in autumn had a particular quality, amber and clear, the kind of light that made everything look exactly like itself, with nowhere to hide. He sat on a rock and smoked and thought about what Catherine Conley had said. He had come here for Franklin Conley. He had come for restitution, or confrontation, or something that he had been calling justice in the privacy of his own thoughts. But the shape of that confrontation had been, in his imagination, a simple and clean thing. 2 men, a wrong, a reckoning. He had not imagined a daughter who ran the store and did the accounts and apologized for things that were not her fault, and told him the truth about her father's bad health with the particular exhausted honesty of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time. He found himself, sitting there by the creek, thinking about the way she had rubbed at the ink on her wrist without accomplishing anything. He found himself thinking about the small joke in Spanish that made the old woman laugh. He found himself, against everything, smiling at nothing in particular. He stopped smiling and reminded himself why he was here, but he could not quite stop thinking about her. Thursday came with high cloud cover that softened the autumn light into something almost gentle. Franklin Conley rode back into Mineral Creek in the mid-afternoon, and Joseph knew it before he saw it because he had been, without fully admitting it to himself, watching the road north from the window of Mrs. Pratt's hotel dining room while pretending to read a 2-week-old newspaper. He saw the man ride in heavyset in his 50s, with a gray beard and a good horse and the bearing of someone accustomed to being comfortable. He looked like what he was, Joseph thought, a man who had done well and told himself he deserved it. Joseph put the newspaper down. He stood up slowly. Then he sat back down. It was not hesitation, exactly. It was something more like an abrupt and forceful collision between what he had planned and what he had learned in the past 2 days. Catherine Conley's face was in his mind, not as a distraction but as a kind of moral complication. She had said she was tired of managing the consequences of her father's bad decisions. She had said she would rather have everything be honest. She was an innocent woman who ran her father's store and kept his books and had, by her own admission, chosen not to look too closely at certain things because the looking would have been too hard. Whatever Joseph did to Franklin Conley, he was going to do in a town where Franklin's daughter lived and worked. Whatever fallout came from a reckoning, legal, financial, or otherwise, was going to fall partly on her. He needed to think about this differently. He left the hotel and walked toward the store. He was not entirely sure what he was doing, but his feet seemed to know the way. The bell above the door rang, and Catherine looked up from behind the counter where she was, he noticed, still doing accounts. Her eyes found him, and she seemed to assess him in the space of one breath. "He is back," she said. "I saw. He came in the back way. He is in the storeroom." She paused. "He does not know you are here yet." Joseph looked at her steadily. "Did you tell him?" "I was waiting," she said simply. "I wanted to talk to you first." "About what?" She came around the counter and walked to the front door and turned the sign to indicate the store was closed, and then she stood in the middle of the room in the afternoon light with her hands folded in front of her and said, "About what I found last night." She had kept looking, she told him. After their conversation the day before, she had gone back to her father's papers, properly this time, not with the deliberate half-attention she had applied before. She had found 3 separate land deeds from California and Arizona, each with the same kind of manufactured deed attached. The Garrison property was not the only one. There were 2 others, a cattle ranch near Flagstaff and a homestead claim in the San Joaquin Valley. All acquired through the same pattern of fraud, all profitable, all folded neatly among her father's papers as though they were simply ordinary business transactions. "He has done this at least 3 times, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tightness around her eyes. "That I found. There may be more." Joseph looked at her. "That is, Catherine, that is the kind of thing that gets a man sent to prison." "I know," she said. "Or worse in some territories." She met his eyes. "I am not asking you to protect him. I want to be clear about that. What he did to your family and to those other families was wrong, and it should have consequences." She pressed her hands together briefly, a small contained gesture. "But I am asking you to let it happen the right way. There is a federal land office in Elko. There is a territorial judge who, I have been told, is an honest man, unlike the one in Bodie. If those deeds can be challenged properly—" "You want me to take it to the law," Joseph said. "I want you to get your ranch back," Catherine said. "The legal way is slower and harder than whatever else you might have been planning, I know, but it is the way that actually gets you the deed back. The other way—" She stopped. Then she said, very quietly, "The other way gets you nothing except a moment, and then whatever comes after the moment." He looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light came through the store windows and caught the escaped curls at her temples and made the ink stain on her wrist visible even from where he stood. "You have thought about this considerably," he said. "I have thought about almost nothing else for 2 days," she said. "That is the honest truth." "Why?" He asked it genuinely, not challengingly. "Why does it matter to you how I handle it? You barely know me." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Because what you do here affects this town," she said. "And because what you do here affects me, and because—" She stopped again. A moment passed. Then she said, "Because you seem like a man worth being honest with, and I have not met many of those." The store was quiet around them. Somewhere in the back, the faint sound of movement indicated Franklin Conley's presence on the other side of the wall. Joseph was very aware of that distance, and very aware of the woman in front of him. "What you are asking," he said slowly, "requires me to walk in there and talk to him, civilly, like a man doing business." "Yes," Catherine said, "and it requires me to be in the room because otherwise he will say whatever suits him and there will be no honest account of it." "You would do that," Joseph said. "You would sit in the same room and hear him account for what he did." "I told you," she said. "I am tired of not looking." The conversation with Franklin Conley happened in the storeroom, and it was not clean or simple or anything like the confrontation Joseph had constructed in 3 years of imagination. It was messy in the way that real things are messy. Franklin blustered first, then deflected. Then when Joseph laid out clearly what he knew and what evidence he had access to and what he intended to do with it, went pale in a way that had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with the recognition that he was genuinely cornered. Catherine sat in the corner on a wooden stool with her hands in her lap and did not say a word the entire time, which was, Joseph thought, more devastating to her father's composure than anything she could have said. She simply witnessed. She looked at him with clear, quiet eyes, and she did not look away. Franklin Conley was not a brave man, it turned out. He was a man who had spent his life finding soft angles and easy paths and had confused that with cleverness. When the soft angles were gone, there was not much left. He agreed, finally, in a voice that had gone very flat, to sign a statement that could be used in the legal proceedings. He had no real choice, and they all knew it. When it was done and Franklin had retreated further into the back, whether out of shame or to find a bottle was unclear, Joseph and Catherine stood in the storeroom doorway in the afternoon quiet. "That was harder than you expected," Joseph said. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly, which he had come to understand was her way. "I will be," she said. "I think I have known for a long time that this was what he was. I just needed to look at it straight." She looked at Joseph. "How about you?" "I am better than I expected," he said, and it was true. The burning in his chest had not disappeared, but it had changed quality, less like a wound and more like a scar. Something that would always be there but that he could live with, that he could move without pain once it properly healed. He stayed in Mineral Creek. He had meant to leave immediately after the confrontation, to ride to Elko and begin the legal process, and then go wherever the next thing took him. He had no fixed place, had not had one since his parents' ranch was taken, and momentum had been the substitute for home for 3 years. But when Thursday ended and Friday began, he found reasons to stay. The papers needed organizing before the trip to Elko. The statement from Franklin Conley needed to be properly copied and witnessed. Mrs. Pratt's hotel was comfortable. The dry goods store needed lamp oil. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of those reasons. Catherine Conley was in Mineral Creek, and he did not want to leave. He recognized this about himself with the slightly rueful self-awareness of a man who has been alone for too long and knows it. He was 31 years old. He had been moving from place to place for 3 years. Before that, he had run the ranch with his father, which had been a good life, and one he had expected to continue indefinitely. He had not, in those 3 years of purposeful motion, allowed himself to think about anything except the next step toward Franklin Conley. The space where other things might have lived: warmth, connection, the ordinary expectation of a future that included another person, had been occupied entirely by this mission. Now the mission was not finished but was in the hands of the law, where Catherine had correctly insisted it belonged. And the space that the mission had occupied was suddenly present and empty and uncomfortable. He went to the store on Friday morning and helped Catherine move a delivery of flour sacks from the wagon that arrived from Elko. She directed the operation with brisk efficiency and clearly did not need his help, but she also did not send him away. They worked side by side in the morning cool, and when it was done, she made coffee on the small stove in the back room, and they drank it standing up, and she asked him about his family's ranch. He told her. He told her more than he had intended to, not just the bare facts of the loss but the living memory of the place. The creek that ran along the eastern pasture and froze in hard winters so that you could hear it cracking from the house. The smell of the valley in spring when the grass came in. The way his father used to stand on the porch in the evenings and look at the mountains with an expression of quiet satisfaction that needed no words. The cattle his grandfather had brought in on foot from Texas before the railroads, before the easy way was possible, because there was no easy way then. 4 generations of a family written into a piece of ground, and a man who had signed his name to something he had not earned, had taken it all in one transaction. Catherine listened the way she did everything with her full attention, making no noise of false sympathy, simply taking it in. When he finished, she said, "You are going to get it back." "I might get a settlement," he said. "The ranch itself has been sold on. Getting the deed back from a San Francisco cattle operation is a different legal fight than getting it from Conley." "Then you will find somewhere else," she said, with a certainty that surprised him. "You are not the kind of man who stops." He looked at her. "How can you tell that? You have known me for 3 days." "3 days is long enough to see certain things," she said. She was looking at him with those direct, dark eyes, and there was something in them now that had not been there in quite the same way before, something warmer, something less careful, something that made his heart do an undignified and unfamiliar thing. "Catherine," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to take you for a ride, this afternoon if you are willing, along the creek south of town. I went out that way on Tuesday, and the light in the evening is worth seeing." She looked at him for a moment, assessing, and then the thing that was related to a smile but better than one took over her face completely. "I will close the store at 4, she said. They rode south along Mineral Creek in the amber evening, Joseph on Copper and Catherine on a gray mare she called Juniper, who was fast enough to keep up and spirited enough to want to. They rode without urgency, the kind of riding that is about the going rather than the getting there. The creek caught the last light and turned it to copper and gold, and the sage smelled sharp and clean, and the mountains went purple against a sky that could not decide between orange and rose. Joseph watched her ride and thought that, whatever he had expected when he came to Mineral Creek, he had been wrong about all of it in ways that now seemed obvious and right. They stopped where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods, the leaves just beginning to turn, a few of them already going gold at the edges. Juniper put her head down and drank. Copper stood companionably and watched the water. "This is what you wanted me to see," Catherine said. "Yes," said Joseph. "You were right about the light." "I usually am about light," he said, and she laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh properly. Not the careful social thing, but the real one, surprised out of her, unguarded. It made him want to hear it again immediately. They sat in the cottonwood shade and talked until the light was gone and the stars came out. And by that time they had been talking for 2 hours, and it had not felt like 2 hours. They talked about books. She had a small but carefully chosen collection, and she had opinions about all of them. They talked about the territory, about the changes coming as the railroads extended further, about what Mineral Creek would look like in 10 years. She thought it would fold when the silver played out. He thought it might survive if someone turned it toward agriculture in the valley to the north. "You are thinking like a rancher," she said. "I am a rancher," he said. "Or I was, or I will be again." "There is land north of here," she said carefully. "Good grazing land. There was a homesteader up there who left 2 years ago. The claim may still be open." He understood that she was telling him something. Not directly, because directness had its limits even for Catherine Conley, but telling him nonetheless. He let it rest there between them, warm and present. "Tell me about your mother," he said. He had noticed that she spoke of her father in that contained, managed way, but had not mentioned a mother. She was quiet for a moment. "She died when I was 12, she said. "A fever. She was a very gentle woman, very kind. She taught me Spanish from Mrs. Vasquez next door to us in Tucson, which is where I grew up. She also taught me to keep accounts, because she said a woman who knows where the money is can never be entirely helpless." "She was right," Joseph said. "She usually was," Catherine said. "I think my father made different choices than he might have made if she had lived. I like to think that anyway." She paused. "I know it may not be true. Some people are who they are regardless, but I like to think it." He reached out and covered her hand with his, very gently, because the look on her face was that particular private kind of grief that comes not from fresh loss, but from having had many years to fully understand what was lost. She looked down at his hand over hers, and then she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the dark by the creek with the stars overhead and the horses breathing peacefully nearby. He rode back into town that night with his chest feeling entirely different than it had 4 days ago. The burning was still there, quieter now but present, and beside it something else entirely, something new and uncertain, and to his own great surprise, welcome. The following weeks had a shape to them that felt, after 3 years of formlessness, remarkable. Joseph rode to Elko with the documents Catherine had organized, the statement from her father, the copies of the fraudulent deeds, the supporting papers she had found in the box. The federal land office there received them with considerably more interest than he had expected, in part because he was not the first to come forward with complaints about Franklin Conley's dealings. There was already a record open on the man. The territorial judge, a tall Ohioan named Prescott who wore his authority lightly, and his attention keenly reviewed everything in a sitting and told Joseph that the case for fraud was solid and that proceedings would begin within the month. The California property, as Joseph had expected, was complicated by subsequent sale, but Judge Prescott said something encouraging about restitution and damages that Joseph was careful not to make too much of. He rode back to Mineral Creek with the legal machinery turning and a lighter heart than he had carried in 3 years. He told Catherine that evening, sitting on the bench outside the store in the cooling dusk. She listened to all of it, and when he finished she said, "Good," with a quiet completeness that meant she had believed this was possible all along. "You knew it would work," he said. "I hoped," she said. "There is a difference." "Not always," he said. She looked at him sideways, a habit she had developed in these weeks of evening conversations, a kind of glancing assessment that she did when he said something that surprised her. "No," she agreed. "Not always." Franklin Conley left Mineral Creek in the 3rd week of November. He did not announce it. He simply was there one day and gone the next, and the horse and the good saddle and several of the items from his room at the hotel were gone with him. He left behind a considerable amount of debt to local merchants, the property documents that Catherine had already copied for the legal case, and a note to his daughter that Catherine showed Joseph without comment. The note said he was going to Colorado on business and would write when he arrived. He had not written by the time Joseph left Mineral Creek the first time, and he would not write for several months after that. And when he finally did, the letter was postmarked from Denver and was characteristically short on specifics. Catherine's reaction to her father's disappearance was not what Joseph had expected, which was to say it was not devastation. It was something more complicated, a kind of exhausted relief overlaid with the particular sadness of a long expectation finally confirmed. She had known what her father was, and she had managed it for years, and now the management was over. The store was technically his property, but the debt and the dishonor that came with his abrupt departure meant that the practical path forward was, she told Joseph with characteristic practicality, to let the creditors sort it out and begin again. "Begin what again?" Joseph asked. "Whatever comes next," she said. They were standing outside the store in the early morning, and she had the key in her hand, and she was looking at the door with an expression that was resolving itself from something complicated into something clearer. "Would you like help?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and the smile came properly this time, the full one, the one he had been cataloging privately for weeks. "I might," she said. "What are you offering Joseph Garrison?" He took a breath. He had been preparing this, not a speech, because he did not do speeches, but something honest and clear, and he said, "I have nothing at the moment. No property, no permanent address, no establishment. I have a horse, some savings, a legal case working through the territorial court, and some considerable feelings for you that have been growing since the morning you told me I needed a barber. If none of that recommends me particularly as a practical proposition, I understand it entirely." Catherine looked at him for a moment that felt, to him, about as long as the 3 years he had spent finding her father. "The feelings recommend you," she said quietly. "The rest is details." He kissed her then, there outside the store in the November morning, in front of whoever in Mineral Creek happened to be awake and watching, which was probably enough people to constitute a witness. She kissed him back with the same direct, unhesitating quality she brought to everything, and it was considerably better than anything he had managed to imagine in the weeks he had spent trying not to imagine it. December came cold and bright, and Joseph did 2 things simultaneously. He pursued the legal case, and he began making inquiries about the land north of town that Catherine had mentioned on their first ride south along the creek. The homestead claim had indeed lapsed, and the process of filing on it was straightforward enough under the Homestead Act, provided he was willing to commit to the work and the residency. He was willing. He was, in fact, eager in a way he had not felt since before his father's death. He and Catherine rode out to look at it together on a sharp December morning, their breath visible in the cold air, the high desert lying around them in that particular winter stillness that made everything feel very large and very clear. The land was 300 acres of open grazing ground with a creek line in the east and a stand of juniper on the south ridge and a spring that flowed year-round. Someone had built a beginning of a cabin near the spring, 4 walls and a roof but no finishing, the inside raw and cold and full of possibility. Catherine stood in the doorway of the unfinished cabin and looked out at the land for a long time. Joseph stood behind her and waited. "It needs a lot of work," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "The spring is a real advantage," she said. "Year-round water here is not something you take for granted." "No. The grazing looks good, better than I expected, actually. The grass is dry now, but you can see how it would come in. There is good bottomland along the creek," he said. "I think with some irrigation work, nothing complicated but systematic, you could put in a kitchen garden, maybe more." She turned from the doorway and looked at him over her shoulder. "You have been planning this," she said. "Thinking about it," he said. "There is a difference." She recognized her own words back at her, and the full smile came. "You are going to file the claim," she said. "I would like to," he said. "Catherine," he stopped. Then he said it because he had never been a man to dress things up past what they were. "I would like to build something here. Not just the ranch, though I want that very much. I would like to build something here with you. If you would consider it." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the wind moved through the junipers on the south ridge and made a sound that was dry and clean and very much like this particular place. "I have been thinking," she said, turning fully to face him now, "about what a life looks like when it is not organized around managing someone else's damage. I have been thinking about it for several years, if I am honest, but I did not know what the alternative looked like until recently." She paused. "I think it looks like this. I think it looks like you." He crossed the space between them and took her face in his hands and kissed her with all the feeling that had been accumulating for weeks, and that he had been, through considerable effort, keeping to appropriate proportions. She put her hands on his chest and kissed him back, and they stood in the doorway of the unfinished cabin on the unbroken land with the winter light all around them. He filed the homestead claim in the first week of January, 1879. He proposed properly, with a ring he had ordered through the dry goods store from a jeweler in Elko. A simple gold band with a small garnet that Catherine had admired in the catalog without saying so out loud, which he had noted. He got down on one knee in the back room of the store on an afternoon when the January wind was loud outside and she was, inevitably, doing accounts. She looked at the ring for a long moment, and then she looked at him and said, "Yes, Joseph Garrison, I will marry you, and you can get up because that floor is filthy and I mean to mop it this afternoon." He got up. He put the ring on her finger. He kissed her. The floor was indeed filthy. They were married in February, in the small church at the north end of Mineral Creek's Main Street, by the Methodist minister who served the town twice monthly and who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only slightly more scripture than was strictly necessary. The witnesses were Mrs. Pratt from the hotel, who cried through the entire thing with complete unself-consciousness, and a rancher named Dwight Haverson from the property to the east of Joseph's new claim, who had already become something of a friend, and Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the elderly Mexican woman who had laughed at Catherine's joke in the store on the day Joseph first walked through the door. Mrs. Vasquez brought flowers from her winter garden's small pale things, delicate and determined, and pressed Catherine's hands between her own and spoke to her in Spanish too fast and quiet for Joseph to follow, and whatever she said made Catherine's eyes go bright. The legal case worked through the territorial court over the spring. Joseph made 2 more trips to Elko and 1 to Carson City, where the land records were held, And each trip he came back with more information and a clearer picture of what could be recovered. The fraud case against Franklin Conley proceeded in absentia, which was its own complicated category of territorial law, but which Judge Prescott, the tall Ohioan, navigated with the efficiency of a man who did not like loose ends. Franklin was never physically brought to court. He seemed to have slipped further west, possibly to Oregon, possibly further, but the documentary evidence was sufficient for the court to void the original transactions and order restitution in the cases where the properties had not been subsequently sold. The Garrison Valley Ranch had been subsequently sold, so what came back to Joseph was not the ranch itself but a settlement money, extracted from the California cattle operation through a separate proceeding that took another several months and the services of a lawyer in Sacramento, but that ultimately resolved in Joseph's favor. It was not the same as the land. He knew that, and he let himself feel it clearly without drowning in it. The money was substantial. It represented the value of what had been taken, which was not the same as the thing itself, but was the closest the law could come. He and Catherine talked about the settlement on a spring evening on the porch of their own cabin, which was no longer unfinished. Joseph had spent the winter working on it steadily, most days from first light until dark, and Catherine had taken leave of the store, which had been taken over formally by its creditors, and then sold to a general merchant from Utah who ran it adequately if without her particular gift, and worked alongside him whenever she could. The walls were plastered. The floors were laid. There were 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, and a proper kitchen lean-to on the south side with a cast-iron range that had been Catherine's specific and non-negotiable requirement, delivered from Elko on a wagon in March. There was a porch with a bench that Joseph had built, and that faced west toward the mountains. They sat on that bench in the April evening, and Joseph had the settlement letter in his hand, and Catherine had a cup of tea, and the spring had come early and the grass to the east was already green along the creek. "It is enough," Catherine said, reading the letter. "More than enough, honestly. You could buy cattle." "I was thinking that," Joseph said. "You could put up proper fencing along the creek pasture," she said, "and there is still the south section that you have not broken. It would need work, but it is good ground." "You have been thinking about this," he said. "I am always thinking about practical things," she said. "It is my nature." She paused. "I was also thinking that Mrs. Haverson told me last week that a family named Rays is moving onto the claim 2 miles north of us, and there is a daughter about my age who apparently has nursing experience. She was trained in San Antonio. It would be good to have someone with that knowledge nearby." He looked at her. She was looking at the mountains with that expression she got when she was about to say something she had been considering carefully for some time. "Catherine," he said. "I am with child," she said, in the same calm, direct voice she used for everything. Then she turned from the mountains and looked at him, and the calm had a tremor in it, something underneath the composure that was not entirely composed. "Since January, I believe. I was going to say something sooner, but I wanted to be certain." He sat with it for a moment, really sat with it, felt the full weight and wonder of it settling in his chest. Then he set the letter down very carefully on the bench beside him and turned to her and took her hands in both of his. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Terrified," she said, "and very happy, in approximately equal parts." He pulled her toward him and she came, setting her head against his shoulder with the ease of someone who had been practicing this and found it natural. He held her carefully, as though she were both very sturdy and very precious, which she was. "Everything is going to be all right," he said, not as a platitude but as a true thing, a thing he believed with a specificity and certainty that he had not felt since before his father's ranch was taken. He had something now. He had built something. He had built it with this woman who had told him to go to the law instead of following the burning in his chest, who had looked at uncomfortable truth without flinching, who had organized the papers and witnessed her father's accounting without faltering, who made coffee standing up and laughed when surprised and kept accounts with ink on her wrist. He had come to Mineral Creek to settle a debt with her father, and he was leaving Owing something to the daughter that he could not name, that was larger than the ranch his grandfather had built, and larger than 3 years of righteous anger, and larger than anything he had thought, riding into that dusty Nevada town on copper with a loaded pistol and a burning chest, that he was capable of feeling. He owed her something he could not name, and he was very glad to spend the rest of his life paying it. The summer of 1879 was hot and long and full of work. Joseph bought 40 head of cattle in June from a rancher near Winnemucca who was moving his operation further north. Good solid Nevada stock that knew the desert and did not waste energy fighting it. He and Dwight Haverson, his neighbor to the east, spent 3 weeks in July fencing the creek pasture, working side by side in the heat with the particular companionship of men doing hard physical work toward a shared purpose. Dwight was a big, quiet Swede who had come to Nevada from Minnesota 15 years earlier and had strong opinions about fencing and no opinions about anything else that he volunteered unprompted, which Joseph found restful. Catherine spent the summer gardening with a ferocity that surprised him until he understood it was the way she processed anticipation. The kitchen garden she put in along the south wall of the cabin was impressive and systematic. She had researched what grew well in the altitude and the climate, had written to an agricultural almanac in Sacramento, and received back a letter of specifics that she studied like scripture. She grew corn and squash and beans in the Three Sisters arrangement she had learned about from Mrs. Vasquez, and tomatoes against the south wall where they could catch reflected heat, and a row of dried chilies that she strung along the porch railing in late August, and that made the whole homestead smell of something warm and specific. She was large with child by August and moved more carefully, but she moved, and she did not stop being who she was, which was to say she did not stop being interested in everything and direct about it, and capable of finding 3 things to improve in any situation within about 30 seconds of looking at it. She drove Joseph half mad with suggestions about the cattle operation and kept the homestead accounts with the same focused precision she had brought to her father's store, and she taught herself basic veterinary care from a manual she ordered from San Francisco because, she said, in a remote property you needed to be able to handle what came up. The baby was born in October, on a crisp, clear morning that smelled of autumn and cattle and the first hint of coming cold. Margaret Reyes, the nursing woman from San Antonio who had settled 2 miles north just as Catherine had predicted, was there, and was skilled and calm in the way of someone who had seen many births and approached each one with fresh respect. Joseph was kept outside, as was the custom, and he stood on the porch with Copper's lead in his hand. The horse was inexplicably calm near him, sensing something in the air, and listened to the sounds from inside the cabin, and was the most frightened he had ever been in his life, which included 3 years of living on the frontier alone, and the confrontation in a Mineral Creek storeroom with a man he had considered potentially dangerous. The sound that came, eventually and after a duration that he would later estimate as approximately a lifetime, was the particular unmistakable cry of a newborn, and he sat down on the bench he had built and pressed his hands over his face for a moment, just a moment, to collect himself before Margaret opened the door and told him in accented English that he had a son, and that both mother and child were well. The son was Thomas Edward Garrison, named for Joseph's father and for Catherine's grandfather, and he was red-faced and furious about the world in the way of all new arrivals, and he had Catherine's dark eyes and the beginning of Joseph's jaw, and he was the most extraordinary thing Joseph had ever seen. He sat beside Catherine in the bed she had made up carefully in preparation, the autumn light coming through the window, and held his son, and Catherine lay back against the pillows with the exhausted serenity of a woman who has accomplished something immense and knows it, and looked at them both. "Thomas," she said quietly, trying the name. "Thomas," he agreed. "He looks like he has already formed opinions," she said. "That is from your side," Joseph said. She laughed the surprised, real laugh, and it was the best sound in the world. Franklin Conley was found in Portland, Oregon, the following spring. Joseph received a letter from Judge Prescott's office informing him that his former father-in-law, which was technically incorrect since the case had been filed before the marriage, but the term felt appropriately precise, had been located, and that proceedings were being arranged. The case concluded the following summer with Franklin Conley receiving a sentence of 3 years in the Oregon Territorial Prison and an order of permanent disbarment from business dealings in Nevada, California, and Arizona. The letter conveying this arrived on a morning when Joseph was in the north pasture looking at the spring grass and thinking about the additional stock he was considering acquiring. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, and stood for a moment looking at the mountains. Then he walked back to the cabin. Catherine was at the kitchen table working through the household accounts, which she did every Tuesday morning with the same focused attention she had always brought to accounting. Thomas, 7 months old and recently of the opinion that he could pull himself to standing if given something to hold on to, was in the corner in the small pen Joseph had built for him, engaged in a determined and largely successful campaign against gravity. He had pulled himself up against the wooden rails and was looking at his mother with an expression of profound triumph. Joseph stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them both. "The case is resolved," he said. Catherine put down her pen. She looked at him. "What was the judgment?" he told her. She received it with the same quiet steadiness she had brought to everything connected with her father. She did not celebrate and she did not mourn. She looked at the table for a moment and then she looked up at him and said, "Are you all right?" "I think I am," he said, and he realized, examining it carefully, that it was true. The burning in his chest that had been there for 3 years, that had driven him across 2 territories and into a Nevada dry goods store, and into the life he was now living, was gone. Not recently gone, but gone for a while now, gradually displaced by other things, better things, things that occupied the space so fully there was simply nowhere for the old grief to live. He crossed the room and sat down across from his wife, and she took his hand across the table, and they sat for a moment in the kitchen of the cabin they had built, with their son watching them from his pen with dark, intelligent eyes in the spring Nevada morning, while the accounts waited and the cattle grazed in the north pasture and the creek ran clear along the eastern edge of their land. "I came here to settle something," he said. "I know," she said. "I owe you something," he said. "I'm not sure how to put it exactly. If you had not told me to go to the law, if you had not organized those papers, if you had not walked into the store," she said. "Yes," he said. "That too." She squeezed his hand and smiled at him, and it was the full one, the good one, and Thomas made a sound of determined effort from his pen as he renegotiated his relationship with gravity, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and made everything very warm and very clear. The years after that had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because no honest life is without difficulty, but with a foundation solid enough to meet difficulty from. The cattle operation grew steadily, not spectacularly, but with the kind of careful, consistent growth that builds something lasting rather than something merely impressive. Joseph worked the land with the deep attention of a man who has known what it is to lose land and does not take the having of it lightly. He was a good rancher, thoughtful and methodical, and he was helped considerably by the fact that his wife had a better head for figures than he did, and kept the operations accounts with a precision that prevented the kind of slow financial drift that destroyed many a frontier enterprise. Catherine's kitchen garden became, over 3 years, an operation that supplied vegetables and preserved goods to 3 neighboring properties and eventually to the general store in Mineral Creek, which the Utah merchant, a decent man named Olson, was glad to carry. It was not the store she had managed before, but it was commerce, and she conducted it with the same focused pleasure she brought to everything she was good at. Their second child came in the spring of 1882, a daughter they named Eleanor after Catherine's mother, who arrived in the world with considerably less drama than Thomas had, and immediately established herself as a person of serene temperament and unshakable determination, which her parents privately agreed was the most formidable possible combination of traits. Thomas, by this time, was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, which satisfied Catherine enormously, and which Joseph tolerated with the patience of a man who has been out-opinionated by the child's mother long enough to have developed genuine respect for the quality. Dwight Haverson married the daughter of the Rays family, not Margaret, who was already married and the mother of 3, but a younger sister named Graciella, who had come to visit in the autumn of 1880 and simply stayed, which pleased Joseph because it meant Dwight was somewhat less taciturn than before, and the evening gatherings between the two properties, which had become a regular thing, were more lively. The Nevada frontier was like that. People found each other in it and made communities out of the finding, and the communities were improbable and various and stronger for being built from choice rather than proximity. Mrs. Vasquez from Mineral Creek came to visit Catherine in the summer of 1882, making the journey from town in the Haverson wagon with the dignity of a woman who has no intention of letting age change her plans. She stayed a week and held Eleanor with the practiced ease of someone who has held many children and told Catherine things about raising daughters that made Catherine laugh, and also write down in the back of her account book. When she left, she pressed Catherine's hands the same way she had at the wedding and said something in Spanish, and Catherine answered in Spanish, and whatever passed between them in that exchange made them both look as though something had been properly and completely said. In the fall of 1882, Joseph rode back to California for the first time since leaving. He went alone with Copper, who was 12 now and still sound and reliable if no longer fast. He needed to see it, needed to close the loop in himself, to stand on the road that had led to the Garrison Valley Ranch and look at what was there now, and make his peace with the distance between what was there and what had been. The ranch was larger now than when his family had owned it. The San Francisco cattle operation had expanded it, added buildings, consolidated neighboring properties. The valley was still beautiful. His memory had not been wrong about that, had not improved it past what it was. The creek along the eastern pasture was still there. The mountains still stood to the north in their particular way. He stood on the road and looked at it for a long time, and then he turned Copper around and started back toward Nevada. He stopped one night in Reno and wrote a letter to Catherine that he mailed before continuing, because he wanted her to have it before he arrived. He told her where he had been and what it had looked like and how he had felt standing there and how he felt riding away. He told her that the thing about losing something you loved was that it changed shape over time, and the loss did not disappear, but the shape it took eventually stopped being the shape of absence and started being the shape of everything you built after. He told her that the valley had been beautiful, and that what they had built in Nevada was also beautiful, and that he found he could hold both of those things without one canceling the other. He told her he was coming home. When he rode back onto their property 5 days later, coming down from the north through the juniper trees on the south ridge in the late afternoon light, the cabin was visible below him with smoke coming from the kitchen lean-to chimney. The kitchen garden had gone to its winter sleep, but the bones of it were clear, the organized rows, the carefully tended soil. The cattle were in the north pasture. The fencing along the creek was exactly as he and Dwight had built it, solid and permanent. Catherine came out onto the porch when she heard Copper, and stood there with Eleanor on her hip and Thomas at her knee, and she raised one hand to shield her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was wearing her blue dress, not the original one but another blue dress that she had made herself, and that was the same color, and her hair was escaping its pins in the same rebellious way it always had, and the ink on her wrist was visible even from a distance. He rode down to the porch and dismounted, and she was there, close enough to touch. And Alina reached immediately for his hat, and Thomas said something rapid and complex about a calf in the north pasture that had gotten itself briefly into trouble, and then out of it, narrating the event with the earnest emphasis of a 2-year-old who considers this the most important news of the day. And Catherine looked at Joseph with the direct dark eyes that he had never once, in all the time since that November morning, gotten tired of. "I got your letter," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad you went," she said. "I think you needed to." "I needed to come back," he said. "That was what I needed." She reached out and took his free hand. Alina had secured the hat and was conducting her own investigation of it, and held it, and he held hers, and they stood on the porch of the cabin they had built in the Nevada high desert with their children, and the evening coming on, and the mountains turning purple in the distance. He had come to Mineral Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1878, with a loaded pistol and a burning chest and 3 years of righteous intention. He had intended to collect a debt from a man who owed him everything. He had left, not immediately, but in the way that mattered, owing something to that man's daughter that he could not precisely name. It was not gratitude, though he was grateful. It was not love, though that was part of it and the most important part. It was something more specific and more complete. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, in the life he was supposed to be living, with the person he had been, without knowing it, without planning it, without any of the careful intention he had brought to every other thing finding his way toward all along. He had never been a man who believed much in providence, the kind of neat celestial arranging that preachers described on Sunday mornings. But there was something in how the whole thing had worked, how he had ridden into that town with the worst of himself in the saddle, and how a woman with ink on her wrist had told him to be better, to do it the right way, to stop and think, and how in stopping and thinking he had found everything. That suggested the universe had, perhaps just this once, been paying attention. 3 years after Thomas was born and Alina was 1, Catherine announced in her characteristic direct fashion, on a Wednesday morning while Joseph was saddling Copper for a run of fence checks, that she believed they were expecting again. She delivered this information with the slightly anticipatory expression of someone waiting to see how a thing they have said will land, and it landed exactly as she hoped, which was to say that Joseph sat down on the mounting block and said, "Truly," in a voice that was larger and quieter than his normal voice, and then stood up and came to her and held her for a moment in the morning cold. "Truly," she confirmed into his shoulder. "When?" "Late winter, I think. February, perhaps." "We will need to finish the second room," he said, which made her laugh the real laugh. "I have already spoken to Dwight about the lumber," she said. Of course she had. The third child was a boy, born in February 1883, as Catherine had predicted. A February baby who arrived in a snowstorm that made the Haverson Road briefly impassable and necessitated Margaret Ray's making the trip on horseback, which she did without complaint, and with the cheerful competence that had made her the most valuable person on the northern Nevada frontier in Joseph's estimate. The boy was healthy and loud and was named James Franklin Garrison, the Franklin chosen carefully and with Catherine's full participation, not to honor her father exactly, but to acknowledge that the name was part of where they had come from, and that where you came from, even the difficult parts of it, was part of who you were. It was Catherine's idea, and Joseph had turned it over for 3 days before agreeing to it, and when he agreed, he felt that it was the most mature thing he had ever done, which he told her, and she said, "Welcome to 34, which made him laugh. Thomas, by this time, was a proper small person with his mother's intensity and his father's patience, which was an improbable combination that somehow worked. He followed Joseph around the ranch with the dedicated attention of a boy who is learning everything and knows it, and he asked questions constantly. About the cattle, about the fencing, about the creek, about how things worked and why, and Joseph answered everything he could and said, "I do not know, let us find out," to everything else, which was the answer Catherine had taught him by example. Eleanor was 3 and largely fearless, which Joseph took a quiet pride in, while Catherine took a more active and pragmatic interest in making sure the fearlessness did not result in anything medical. Eleanor had decided that Copper, the aging bay gelding, was her particular friend, and Copper bore her attentions with the dignified patience of a horse who has earned a comfortable old age and accepts its pleasures gracefully. The spring of 1883 was warm, and the cattle came through the winter in good condition, and the kitchen garden went in early, and the whole enterprise had the feeling of something well established, something that had put down roots and could be trusted to last. Joseph rode the northern fence line one April morning and stood at the highest point, the juniper ridge on the south, and looked at the whole of it below him. The cabin, the outbuildings, the garden, the creek glinting in the morning, the cattle in the pasture, the smoke from the kitchen chimney indicating that Catherine was at the stove and that breakfast was either complete or imminent. He thought about his father, who had stood on a porch in California and looked at mountains with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He thought about his grandfather, who had brought cattle from Texas before the railroads because there was no easy way. He thought about the moment in a Nevada storeroom when a man had signed his name to something he did not believe in and began the long collapse of his own life, and how Joseph had followed that collapse across 2 territories and into a dry goods store and found something he had not gone looking for. He thought about Catherine, who had told him to go to the law instead of following his burning chest, and who had organized the papers and witnessed her father's accounting and opened the store at 8 o'clock, and closed it at 4 and ridden along the creek in the amber evening, and held his hand in the dark by the cottonwoods, and said yes to his proposal and no to the dirty floor, and managed the garden accounts and the ranch accounts and 3 children and a home with the same focused, direct, competent love she brought to everything. He owed her something he had never been able to name. He turned Copper and rode down from the ridge toward home. She was on the porch when he came in, Eleanor on her hip and James in the small cradle Joseph had built during the winter that sat near the kitchen door during good weather, and she looked up at him with the expression she had when she had been thinking, and the thinking had reached a conclusion she was ready to share. "I have been looking at the account books," she said as he dismounted. "Of course you have," he said. "We are doing well," she said. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of a fact she found meaningful. "We are doing genuinely well, Joseph." "I know," he said. "I would like to put some of the surplus toward a proper schoolroom. For the children, and for the Haverson children and the Ray's children. I have been writing to a woman in Carson City who trained as a teacher and who is interested in frontier work." She looked at him with the anticipatory expression. "I thought perhaps we could build it on the east pasture edge, where the 2 properties meet, so it is convenient to both families." He stood with Copper's reins in his hand and looked at her, this woman who had taken a life organized around managing damage and turned it, through sheer force of capable love, into something that was now extending outward past their own borders to offer something to children they did not know yet. "Write to the teacher," he said. "Tell her to come." Catherine smiled, the full one, the real one, the one that had made him turn around in every room she was in since the first November morning. "I already wrote," she said. "I was waiting to see what you said." He shook his head. He could not help it, the grin. "You are impossible," he said. "You chose this," she reminded him. "I would choose it again," he said. "Every time." She reached out and put her hand against his face briefly, with the ease and intimacy of a woman who has been touching this particular face for 5 years and intends to touch it for many more. And then she went inside because James had woken from his nap and was making his feelings known in the thorough way of Franklin babies. Joseph unsaddled Copper and gave him fresh water and rubbed him down in the small barn that smelled of hay and leather and horses, the same smell as every barn he had ever known, the smell that meant work and care, and the particular satisfaction of a working life. He did it carefully and without hurry, because a man who sees to his horse before himself is a man who knows what matters. He came out into the spring evening where the light was amber, and the mountains were purple, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney was going straight up in the still air. He went up the porch steps, and through the door of the cabin he had built with these hands on this land that was his. And behind him the door closed on the evening, and inside was warmth and noise, and the smell of dinner cooking and his family, all of them, every particular and irreplaceable one of them. He had come to Mineral Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1878, owing a debt to a man who had wronged his family. He had left, in every way that counted, owing something to that man's daughter, something he had carried ever since without resentment, without weight, as a kind of permanent glad debt, the kind that is nothing like a burden because the paying of it is identical to the living of the best possible life. The kitchen was warm, and Catherine was at the stove, and Thomas was telling Alina something that was apparently of critical importance, and James was in the cradle by the window looking at the world with the considering expression that was already, at 3 months, distinctly his own. And outside the mountains went to dark against a sky full of stars, the same Nevada sky that had looked down on the whole of it, the riding inn, the dry goods store, the evening by the creek, the storeroom accounting, the proposal on the dirty floor, the building and the planting and the growing and the arriving, and Joseph Garrison stood in his own kitchen and was home.